He does not scream when the shrapnel tears into him. He just tightens his jaw, presses the blood-soaked handset closer to his mouth, and repeats the numbers that will kill him. He is lying face down in the jungle mud, lungs burning from smoke and cordite. Japanese soldiers shout somewhere in the darkness around him, their voices getting closer with every second. He can hear the clatter of metal, the snap of branches under boots, the short, controlled orders of men who know their prey is trapped. The radio on his back feels like it weighs 100 pounds. The antenna is bent, the casing cracked, but the signal is still alive. On the other end of that line, far away on a ship he cannot see, American gunners are waiting for his words. They cannot hear the gunfire around him. They cannot smell the blood. All they have are his coordinates. He is a United States Marine. He is a Navajo Code Talker. And right now, he is doing something no training manual ever described. He is calling an artillery strike on his own position. The officer next to him is already dead. 2 other Marines from his 7-man team lie motionless nearby, half covered by leaves and dirt. The jungle around them is a maze of flickering shadows and muzzle flashes. Tracers cut through the air like red-hot needles. The Japanese are not firing blindly anymore. They know exactly where he is. A grenade lands too close. The explosion slams his head into the ground, and for a heartbeat, everything goes white. When his vision snaps back, the handset is a few inches from his fingers, connected by a cord that looks impossibly thin compared to the chaos around him. He drags it back toward his face with numb, shaking hands. The voice from the other end crackles through the static. A calm American tone in a world that has gone insane, asking him to confirm the coordinates one more time. The artillery battery needs to be sure. The numbers he just sent will drop high explosive shells directly onto the small patch of jungle where he and the last of his team are still breathing. Confirm grid. Say again. Are you sure? He closes his eyes for half a second. He can taste dirt and iron. He knows exactly what those shells will do. He has seen artillery work before. Trees shredded, bodies torn apart. Nothing left that can move or speak or answer questions. And that is the point. Because somewhere in this tightening circle of Japanese soldiers, there is a new objective. Not just to kill the intruders. Not just to wipe out another Marine reconnaissance team. There is a specific order that has changed everything about this fight. Capture the radio operator alive. They have heard his voice. They have heard him speak a language that makes no sense. Not English. Not code numbers. Not anything they recognize. They have been intercepting these strange transmissions for months. They know the Americans are using some kind of system they cannot break. A voice that turns battles against them before they even understand what is happening. Now, for the first time, they have one of those voices pinned down in the jungle with nowhere to run. The Code Talker understands this as clearly as they do. All day, he has been relaying information in Navajo that no Japanese officer can decode. Positions of enemy artillery, strength of infantry units, weaknesses in their perimeter. Every word he has spoken has brought American fire down on Japanese positions miles away. But if they take him alive, everything changes. He is not just a man anymore. He is a living key to the most closely guarded secret in the Pacific War. If they force him to talk, if they break him, if they even get him to translate a handful of intercepted messages, the entire Navajo Code begins to unravel. The secure web of communication that has kept Marine operations one step ahead suddenly becomes exposed. He knows the stories. Every code talker does. They have been warned, not in official briefings, but in the quiet spaces between missions. Some carry pistols reserved for one final bullet. Some carry small vials they tell no one about. No one says the word out loud, but the meaning is clear. You are more dangerous captured than killed. The enemy must never learn how this language works. They must never connect the strange words to the letters and units and locations they represent. They must never understand that when he says the Navajo word for turtle, he means a tank, that a whale is a battleship, that an egg is a bomb, that entire operations move because of syllables only a few hundred people on Earth can understand. If that secret dies with him tonight, the war goes on with the code intact. If that secret breaks, because he survives in enemy hands, thousands of Marines he will never meet may die in battles where the Japanese know every move in advance. He hears them again, closer now. The snap of a safety being switched off. A low order in Japanese. A flashlight beam slices through the trees above his position. They are not spraying bullets wildly anymore. They are moving in, controlled and deliberate, like hunters who know the animal in the trap is worth more alive than dead. The voice on the radio asks one last time, confirm. Are you certain about these coordinates? His answer is steady, even though his body is anything but. He gives them the grid again. He gives it in perfect clarity. No hesitation, no stutter. The same calm precision he has used in every battle where his words meant life or death for Marines he could not see. Then he does something no Japanese cryptographer will ever be able to decode. He switches languages. He stops speaking English, stops using the plain numbers the battery expects. Instead, he slips into Navajo, the sound rolling off his tongue like it did when he was a child on the reservation, before he even knew what a war was. He adds one sentence that the men at the guns will not understand fully, but will feel in the silence that follows. Send it. All of it. Right here. No evacuation request. No plea for rescue. No bargaining for time. He is not asking for a miracle. He is giving an order. Fire mission. Danger close. Maximum spread. Right on top of us. He pushes himself up just enough to look at the surviving members of his team. 2 men, both wounded, both staring at him with the kind of exhausted clarity only found in people who know there are no good options left. They cannot hear the battery officer. They do not know the exact words just spoken in Navajo. But they understand his face. There is no argument, no speech, no dramatic exchange of last words. They are Marines. They know what capture means, especially for the man holding the radio. One of them nods once, slow and deliberate, as if signing a contract neither of them will ever see fulfilled. In the darkness far offshore, the first guns recoil. The shells that will decide the fate of a secret language are already in the air. That is where this story begins. Not with a flag raising, not with a parade, not even with Pearl Harbor. It begins in a patch of Pacific jungle where one man has just made a decision that will rewrite the unwritten rules of war. To understand how he came to this moment, how a Navajo boy from the dry mesas of the American Southwest ended up calling fire on his own position in a language the enemy could not break, the story has to go back. Back before the jungle, before the uniform, before the first radio transmission ever left his lips. Back to the very beginning of the code that was never supposed to fall into enemy hands at all. He used to hate the wind on the reservation. Out there in New Mexico, it could blow for days. scraping sand across the skin, whistling through cracks in the windows, rattling the thin walls of the small house where his family lived. As a boy, he would lie awake at night and listen to it, trying to pick out patterns, rhythms, anything that made it sound less wild, less random. His grandmother told him the wind carried stories. His father told him it carried warnings. Years later, in the Pacific jungle, the wind carried something else entirely. It carried death, the wrong rustle in the leaves, the faint clink of metal on metal, the whisper of men moving where no one should be. Out here, if you misheard the wind, you did not just lose sleep, you lost your life. His name, in Navajo, meant something simple and grounded, tied to the earth his people had walked for generations. The Marines shortened it the first week of training, stumbling over the syllables until they decided it was easier to give him another name. They called him Joe. It went on his helmet, his paperwork, the stencils on his gear. To them, he was Private Joe Begay, United States Marine Corps. To his family, he was still the boy who listened to the wind. Joe remembered the day he signed the enlistment papers with perfect clarity. It was not driven by patriotic speeches or posters. It was driven by a quiet mix of anger and opportunity. News of Pearl Harbor had reached the reservation late and distorted, carried by scratchy radio signals and secondhand reports. He had never seen the ocean, never seen a battleship, but he understood what an attack on his country meant. And he understood something else, something that dug even deeper. For generations, the government had tried to erase his language. Boarding schools, punishments for speaking Navajo, lessons delivered only in English, teachers who said their words were backwards, primitive, useless in the modern world. Now that same government was asking for Navajo speakers, asking them to bring the language they had tried to bury and use it to protect the nation that had once tried to silence it. The contradiction burned in him, but it also challenged him. If his language was powerful enough to be a weapon, then it was worth fighting for. If his people could take something the outside world had called worthless and turn it into the one thing the enemy could not break, then every insult, every punishment, every attempt to erase Navajo suddenly looked like a mistake the Marines were desperate to correct. Boot camp was the first time Joe realized how different his path would be from the other recruits. Everyone learned to march, to shoot, to dig foxholes, to field strip a rifle blindfolded. But after lights out, when most Marines tried to sleep or played cards under blankets, a small group of Navajo men whispered to each other in the dark, building a new kind of battlefield language piece by piece. They did not just memorize a list of words. They built a system. Turtle for tank, whale for battleship, hummingbird for fighter plane, egg for bomb. Some of the choices made everyone smile. Some hit with a strange, quiet weight. Death, destruction, the cold machinery of war, all translated into words their grandparents had used to tell stories about animals, rivers, and mountains. Joe picked it up fast, faster than most. He had always listened more than he talked. On the reservation, that had made him seem distant. In code talker training, it made him dangerous. He could hold entire message chains in his head, translate them on the fly, and spit them back out in Navajo with a smooth, unbroken rhythm that made other trainees glance over with something like respect. The first time they tested him under pressure, they did it without warning. A staff sergeant burst into the room, barked coordinates, unit designations, call signs. Another Navajo Marine stood at the far end with a radio handset pressed to his ear. The sergeant spoke only English. Joe had to catch every fragment, convert it to code on the spot, and transmit it in Navajo without dropping a single detail. He did not think. He just listened. His mouth moved almost on its own, pulling words from that new vocabulary and welding them to places, units, and times. When it was over, the officers compared his decoded message with the original written order. Not one discrepancy, not one missed number. 10 minutes of high-speed traffic, all perfect. That earned him something more than a nod. It earned him a reassignment. When deployment orders came down, Joe's name was not on the list for a regular infantry platoon. It was on a smaller list: hand-picked men, radio operators, scouts, and one code talker assigned to each small recon team pushing deep behind Japanese lines. The first time he saw the ocean was on the deck of a troopship. The smell hit him before the sight did: salt, fuel, sweat, and rust. The horizon was a flat line that seemed to go on forever. Nothing like the broken mesas and dry canyons of home. Some of the other Navajo men stood with him at the rail, staring out, silent. For a moment, none of them were Marines. They were just kids from the desert who had somehow been dropped onto a moving piece of steel headed into a world of water and fire. The older Marines on board watched them with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. To some, the idea of using an indigenous language as a weapon still sounded like a joke, a rumor, something cooked up by officers who read too many newspaper articles. But the first time they heard a live demonstration, skepticism turned into something else. On the second day at sea, a captain gathered a group of Marines on the main deck. 2 Navajo Code Talkers stood on opposite sides of the crowd, each with a field radio. The captain handed a sheet of paper to the first man and told him to transmit it. A page packed with unit movements, grid coordinates, and timed operations. The kind of thing that would normally take a qualified radio operator half an hour to encrypt and send using standard methods. The first code talker read the page once, handed it back, and began speaking into the handset in Navajo. No pauses, no corrections. The second code talker listened, then repeated the message in English to the captain standing over his shoulder. It took less than 3 minutes from first word to final confirmation. One of the sergeants checked the decoded message against the original. His eyebrows climbed higher with each line he read. When he hit the bottom of the page, he looked up and said what everyone else was thinking. That is impossible. But it was not impossible. It was just human voices used in a way no machine could match. Speed, accuracy, and security all wrapped into one system no Japanese officer could crack. In that moment, Joe saw something change in the eyes of the men around him. They did not suddenly understand Navajo. They did not suddenly become experts in cryptography. But they understood this. As long as those quiet voices kept talking, the odds on the battlefield tilted slightly in their favor. By the time Joe reached the Solomons, the romance of deployment was gone. The air was hot and wet, the ground a mixture of mud and rotting plants that soaked through boots and left a permanent smell in everything. Mosquitoes did not care about rank. Malaria did not care about training. The jungle swallowed sound and then amplified it without warning, turning every broken twig into a question mark. His first days near the front were spent in dugouts and under makeshift canopies, headset pressed to his ears, listening to a constant river of voices. Call signs, fire missions, situation reports, urgent requests for medics. Occasionally, amid the noise, came the familiar flow of Navajo. Code talkers passing coordinates, calling for artillery, relaying orders to units he would never see. One night, a mortar round landed near a forward command post. Joe and another operator hit the dirt as shrapnel ripped through the canvas above them. When the dust settled, an officer screamed for a status check. Radios had gone dead. Antennas bent, lines cut. Only one set still worked. Joe's. He slid back into position, fingers moving on instinct, voice steady. A unit pinned down on a ridge needed covering fire. Enemy machine guns in the tree line, flares already burning out. If the guns did not go silent in the next few minutes, men on that ridge were not going to see sunrise. Joe listened to the English, converted on the fly, and fired back in Navajo. Gun positions became landmarks only he and his fellow code talkers would understand. Directions wrapped in animal names and natural features. To a Japanese listener, it would have sounded like a bedtime story told at high speed. To the artillery batteries, it was a precise firing solution. The next day, a captain from that ridge came to find him. He was dirty, tired, and still shaking with the leftover adrenaline of a night spent too close to death. He did not salute. He just looked at Joe and said, "Whoever was talking on that radio last night, you kept a lot of us alive." Joe did not know what to say. He had not fired a rifle. He had not thrown a grenade. He had not charged a position. He had sat in a hole and talked. But in this war, that was enough to shift outcomes, enough to move the invisible line between survival and body bags. That was when the recon platoon commander noticed him. A lean, quiet officer with maps, always folded just so, and a reputation for going where the enemy did not expect Marines to be. He watched Joe work for days, saying little, just taking in the speed and clarity of his transmissions, the way he checked coordinates twice even when under pressure, the way he listened longer than he spoke. When new mission orders came down, the commander called Joe into a small tent. On the table were aerial photos of a small island to the north, grainy black and white images showing patches of jungle, a thin strip of beach, and faint scars that might have been roads or supply trails. "Intelligence thinks the Japanese are building something here," the officer said. "Artillery positions, supply dumps, maybe a staging area. We do not know how big. We do not know how fast. What we do know is we cannot hit what we cannot see." He tapped a point on the map with his finger. "We are sending in a small team. 7 men. In and out. No heroics. Get eyes on the ground, confirm what is there, and get out before they know we were ever close. For that, we need a radio. And for that radio, we need someone who can talk without handing them our playbook." The officer met his eyes. "You are coming with us." Joe did not hesitate. He felt the familiar knot in his stomach, the mix of fear and purpose that had followed him since basic. This was not like sitting in a command post, relaying messages written by someone else. This would be direct. He would see the enemy he was reporting on. He would walk through their territory with only the jungle between them. That night he rolled his blanket out on a patch of ground that barely counted as dry and stared up at a sky he could not fully see through the canopy. He thought of his grandmother, of the stories she told about warriors and spirits, about choices made at the edge of what a person could stand. None of those stories had mentioned radios or coordinates, but the feeling was the same. There came a point where you stepped into something you could not walk back from. In the dark, with only the distant rumble of artillery for company, Joe made a quiet promise to himself. If he went behind enemy lines with this team, the code went with him. If he came back, the code came back intact. If he did not, then it would not be because someone had ripped it out of him under a bare bulb in some jungle shack. A few days later, just before dawn, he climbed into a small boat with 6 other Marines. None of them talked much. The engine coughed to life, and the shoreline began to slip away. The air smelled different out here, heavy with salt and something metallic. Joe checked the radio for the 20th time, fingers moving over dials and switches he already knew by touch. The others checked rifles, grenades, knives. No one asked him if he was ready. They just assumed he was. He was the voice. They were the ones who would pull the triggers if things went bad. Together, they were supposed to be a ghost. In, out, unseen. As the boat cut through the dark water toward the silhouette of the island, the wind picked up. Joe listened to it out of habit. It did not sound like the wind from home, but it still carried something. Not stories, not warnings, just a simple, heavy truth. If anything went wrong on that island, the only thing standing between what he knew and what the Japanese wanted to know would be him. The jungle did not explode all at once. It tightened slowly, like a fist, closing around their throats. For the first 2 days on the island, everything went almost too well. They moved by night and lay still by day, buried in shadows and rotting leaves. The Japanese patrol patterns were predictable. The camp below their observation ridge pulsed with the same routines Joe had heard described in briefing rooms 100 miles away. Trucks rumbled in at dawn. Men formed up for roll call. Artillery crews cleaned their guns. At night, the glow of cigarettes floated like fireflies above slit trenches and sandbag walls. Joe spoke little, but his voice was everywhere. Each time they reached a new vantage point, he unfolded the radio like it was a ritual, antenna up, dials set, headset on. He would glance once at the target area, then drop into Navajo, turning what he saw into a stream of syllables that only another code talker, far away, could unwrap. Enemy strength. Heavy guns here. Supply dumps there. Movement on the eastern flank. He knew the information was valuable by the way the responses came back from headquarters. Short acknowledgments. No wasted words. They were already thinking ahead, plugging his reports into plans that would shape the next stage of the campaign. The team leader, Lieutenant Harris, never hovered over him during transmissions. He would stand a few feet away, eyes on the tree line, rifle held low, but ready. When Joe finished and broke the radio down again, Harris would always ask the same simple question. They got it? Joe would nod. Yeah, they got it. On the second night, they watched a supply convoy arrive under blackout conditions. No headlights, no shouting, just shapes moving in the dark, guided by whispered orders and the faint outline of trucks against the dim sky. The Japanese were careful, disciplined. These were not conscripts dragged from somewhere and thrown onto an island. These were units that knew they mattered. Joe noted every detail he could. Number of vehicles, crates unloaded, the position of fuel barrels near the edge of the tree line, the exact angle of the new gun pits being dug on the northern slope. Every piece was another line of code built from his language, sent into the night. When he finished that transmission, the reply from headquarters took a little longer than usual. The voice that finally came back sounded different. The tone was tighter, more urgent. Stand by for further tasking. Priority target confirmation. Remain in position, if possible. Harris heard just enough through Joe's headset to know what it meant. They were no longer just observers. They were now part of a live targeting chain. The artillery and bombers would not just be hitting general areas. They would be hitting exactly what this 7-man team identified. Any mistake in Joe's words could mean shells landing on the wrong grid. On the wrong men. They slept in shifts, if at all. The third morning began like the previous two. Humidity pressed on them like a wet hand. Insects swarmed anything that stayed still too long. The Japanese camp below seemed normal at first glance. Cook fires, morning routines, the distant clank of artillery shells being handled by practiced crews. It took a few hours for the difference to register. There were more guards on the perimeter, more movement in the jungle beyond the visible edge of the camp. Short, sharp bursts of radio traffic carried faintly up the ridge, different from the steady background chatter of routine operations. Harris noticed it first. He lay on his stomach, binoculars pressed to his eyes, watching the southern approach to the camp. "They are nervous," he muttered under his breath. "Something has them spooked." Joe felt it too, even without the binoculars. The pattern had shifted. Soldiers were stopping to look into the trees more often. Patrol routes stretched farther out than before. The easy, repetitive rhythm of men who felt secure had been replaced by small, edgy movements. A glance over the shoulder here, a longer pause at a junction there. He waited until they had rotated lookouts and everyone had eaten something that barely passed for breakfast before unfolding the radio again. The transmission to headquarters was short this time. Enemy activity increased, perimeter expanded. Possible suspicion of observation. The response came back quickly. Understood. Maintain coverage as long as safe. Extraction window unchanged. Safe. The word sat in the humidity like a joke no one laughed at. That afternoon, the first sign that things were truly wrong came not from what they saw, but from what they heard. A single rifle shot, distant but clear, snapped through the jungle to the west. Then silence. No follow-up. No burst of fire. Just that one flat crack that did not fit any pattern. Harris froze. Everyone froze. "That is not training," he said quietly. "That is not a warning shot. That is contact." Minutes dragged. Then more shots. Closer. Short bursts. Then nothing. Someone out there was running into something they did not expect. Joe's stomach tightened. They were not the only American unit operating in this sector. If another recon team had been compromised, the Japanese would be fully alerted now. Search parties, aggressive sweeps, new orders. They did not have to wait long to confirm it. Just before dusk, a Japanese platoon moved through the camp below in full combat gear. They had packs, extra ammunition, and radio operators in tow. Officers barked clipped commands. The group split into smaller elements and vanished into the jungle in 3 different directions. "They are hunting," Harris said. "Question is, do they know for what?" No one answered, because everyone knew. By nightfall, the jungle felt wrong, too quiet in some directions, too noisy in others. Branches snapped in places that should have been empty. Whispers floated on the wind, always just at the edge of clear hearing. They shifted position under cover of darkness, moving parallel to the ridge to a secondary observation point they had marked on the map before insertion. Standard procedure. Never sleep twice in the exact same spot. Never assume yesterday's cover is good enough today. The new position gave them a slightly different angle on the camp, but more importantly, it pulled them deeper into the tangle of trees and undergrowth. Less open ground, more layers between them and any patrol sweeping the higher slopes. Around midnight, Joe was on watch when he heard it. Not the sound of men talking, not footsteps. Something smaller, more mechanical. Metal clicking softly against metal. Rhythmic, moving. He eased himself forward, eyes searching the darkness. At first he saw nothing. Then between two trees 20 yards downslope, a thin shadow shifted wrong against the background. He realized what he was hearing, a rifle sling buckle tapping lightly against a canteen as someone walked slowly, carefully, just out of direct sight. He slid backward and touched Harris's boot. The lieutenant was awake instantly, hand on his weapon. Joe did not speak. He just pointed. They watched together as the shadow moved again, then another, 3, maybe 4 men. No light. Spaced out. Professional. Harris's jaw tightened. "They are here," he whispered, "and they are not lost." They stayed dead still until the shapes moved past, heading along the contour of the slope, probing. If the patrol had shifted 15 yards higher, they would have walked directly into the team's position. As it was, they were close enough that Joe could hear them breathing when the wind shifted. When the patrol finally slipped out of earshot, no one relaxed. Because patrols did not move alone. Patrols laid the lines. Then the net followed. At first light, the scale of the problem revealed itself. From their new vantage point, they could see additional activity beyond the camp perimeter. Lines of men sweeping through the jungle in coordinated arcs. Officers with maps stopping to check bearings. Signal flags flashing briefly among the trees. Someone had found something. Maybe boot prints. Maybe a broken branch where there should not have been one. Maybe the bodies of another recon team that had not been as lucky. It did not really matter what. The effect was the same. The Japanese were no longer guarding just a camp. They were hunting for ghosts they now believed were real. Harris gathered the team in a shallow dip behind the ridge crest. His voice was low, but no one had trouble hearing the edge in it. "We are blown," he said. "If they do not know exactly where we are, they know we exist. That is enough." One of the Marines, a big corporal named Flynn, swallowed hard. "So we exfiltrate, right? We pull back to the beach, call for the boat, and get the hell out before they tighten this up." Harris shook his head once. "Orders from command hold," he said. "They still need confirmation on the number of heavy guns and the exact layout before they commit air and artillery. We have not seen the eastern sector yet. They want that picture." Flynn stared at him. "With respect, sir," he said, "that jungle is about to be crawling. If we go deeper, we are not getting out." Harris did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He just looked at each man in turn, ending with Joe. "Mission comes first. We move east. We get what they need. Then we head for the extraction point. If we run into contact before then, we break south and try to lose them in the low ground. We stay off the ridge lines. We keep the radio dark unless we have to speak. No unnecessary transmissions. Understood?" They all understood what he really meant. If the situation went bad, there were 2 priorities: the radio, and the man who could make that radio more dangerous than any rifle. The move to the east flank was slower, more deliberate. Every step felt loud. Every snapped twig sounded like a shout. Joe kept replaying the routes in his head. turning the map into a mental pattern of ridges, ravines, and potential choke points. He had studied terrain his whole life, even if he had not called it that. On the reservation, it had meant knowing where water was, where shelter could be found, where a wrong step meant getting lost. Here, it meant guessing where an enemy patrol would try to cut them off. By late afternoon, they reached a narrow saddle overlooking the eastern arm of the camp, and for a moment, the risk felt justified. Below them, partially hidden by camouflage nets and hacked branches, were the missing pieces. More artillery positions, a line of ammunition bunkers, what looked like a field headquarters dug into the hillside. Harris's eyes lit up with the cold satisfaction of a man who recognized a completed picture. "There it is," he said. "That is the punch they have been building." Joe slipped the radio from his pack with hands that did not feel quite steady. This transmission would be the most important one yet. If they got it out clean, the Navy and the Marine artillery would know exactly where to hit to cripple this staging ground. He extended the antenna, adjusted the frequency, and waited for the tiny change in tone that told him the set was ready. Harris watched the tree line while the others formed a loose perimeter, rifles pointed outward, eyes scanning the green. Joe called in, got a clear line almost immediately. He began to speak. In Navajo, the eastern flank turned into a stream of images. Big guns, bunkers, fuel stores, coordinates wrapped in familiar words that no Japanese ear could untangle. Halfway through the transmission, he felt it, rather than heard it. A slight tremor in the ground, a subtle shift in the wind, the almost inaudible click of a distant safety being taken off. He finished the sentence he was on, forced himself not to rush the last coordinate. Then he cut the transmission. Harris turned his head a fraction. Problem? Joe did not answer. He just pointed back along the trail they had used to reach the saddle. There, barely visible between two thick tree trunks, a shape moved. Not full on. Just a shoulder, a helmet, a flick of cloth. Then another, then another. They were pinned on high ground with the enemy below and now, unmistakably, the enemy above. The net was not closing. It was closed. In that moment, Joe understood what the Japanese had figured out. They were not just looking for any recon team. They were looking for the radio. They were looking for the voice that spoke the language their code breakers could not touch. They would not risk killing that voice if they could help it. From here on, bullets would not be the only threat. Hands, ropes, questions asked with fists and knives and hours of pain. Capture was no longer a distant briefing room scenario. It was a reality moving toward them through the trees. And every step those men took narrowed Joe's choices, one by one. The first shot came from above and behind, exactly where no one wanted it to. A single crack. Bark splintered off a tree inches from Flynn's head. He dropped flat, swore once, and returned fire on reflex, sending 3 rounds into the green without a target he could actually see. The jungle responded all at once. Rifles opened up from 2 directions, then 3. Muzzle flashes winked between the trees like brief, angry stars. Bullets tore through leaves, slapped into trunks, kicked dirt over their boots. The quiet observation point became a killing ground in less than 3 seconds. Down. All of you? Down, Harris snapped. They slid behind what little cover the saddle offered. It was not much. A fallen log, a shallow depression, roots that were never designed to stop bullets. The only thing keeping them alive in those first frantic moments was the fact that the Japanese were still cautious. The fire was heavy, but not wild. They were probing, not charging. "They want us pinned," Harris said, through clenched teeth. "They are not trying to wipe us in one go." Joe did not waste time answering. He was already dragging the radio closer, hands moving by feel. The set had taken a glancing hit in the first volley. One side of the casing was chipped, but the antenna was intact. The signal might still hold. Flynn fired another short burst uphill, then cursed. "They are on both sides," he shouted over the noise. "At least a squad up top. More downslope. We are boxed." The ground around Joe spat dirt as a round smacked into the edge of the depression. He flinched, then reached for the handset. "We need to move," one of the other Marines yelled. "We stay here, they bracket us and roll right over." "Move where exactly?" Harris snapped back. "Straight into the line they are tightening." "No. We break cover without a plan. We last 30 seconds. Another shot came in low, skipping off a rock and shredding the lower branches of a bush over Joe's head. He heard the metallic whine of shrapnel, felt something hot graze his ear. He forced himself to think in straight lines. Contact. Surrounded. High ground and low ground, both compromised. No clear retreat route, no chance of slipping away without leaving bodies behind and a trail the Japanese could follow. And a radio. And a code talker. Harris crawled to his side, keeping low, helmet almost scraping the dirt. "Can you get them?" he asked. "Can you raise the guns from here?" Joe flicked a switch, listened to the faint hiss in his earpiece, then keyed the transmitter. The familiar call sign sequence rolled off his tongue out of habit. For a second he heard nothing but static. Then a voice cut through, thin but clear. "Receiving. Go ahead." The normal part of his brain wanted to ask for an extraction, for smoke, for a miracle. The part of his brain that had listened in training when officers talked about worst-case scenarios knew none of that was realistic. There was no fast rope team waiting just offshore, no platoon that could fight its way uphill through prepared positions in time. Harris leaned in close, eyes never leaving the trees. "Tell them we are compromised," he said. "Give them our situation. See what they say." Joe kept his voice steady, even as rounds cracked overhead and the smell of hot metal and churned earth thickened in his throat. He did not use code for this part. He spoke in plain English. Location, enemy strength, encirclement. No viable egress. The reply came faster than he expected. The Artillery Fire Direction Center did not waste time on sympathy. Understood. Hold position if able. Stand by for fire mission options. Fire mission options. The phrase landed like a weight. Up the slope, a Japanese soldier shouted something sharp. The gunfire shifted, focused on the log that Flynn and another Marine were using as partial cover. Chips flew. A round punched through and caught the other man high in the chest. He jerked, rolled once, and went still. Flynn grabbed his collar, tried to pull him back, then ducked as another burst chewed the ground, where his head had been a second earlier. "We are losing this spot," Flynn shouted. "We either move or we die under this log." "We move, we die in the open," Harris shot back. His voice was flat, controlled, but his eyes were calculating distances, angles, probabilities, at a speed that made Joe's head swim. The artillery officer came back on the line, voice clipped, all business. "We can give you suppression on the lower slope and the eastern approach. Risk of friendly casualties high. Can you mark your exact position?" Joe knew what that meant. Without precise coordinates, the best the guns could do was throw steel at the general area, maybe buy them a few minutes, maybe hit as many Japanese as Marines. It would not break the encirclement. It would just make the dying louder. He glanced at Harris. "They want our exact grid," Joe said, "for accurate fire. They can hit the guns, the bunkers, the approach routes, but they need us to mark ourselves." Harris's jaw flexed once. "What are the odds they can thread that needle without turning this hill into a crater?" he asked. Joe did not answer. He did not have to. Another Marine cried out as a bullet tore through his thigh. Blood soaked into the already dark soil. The medic of the team crawled to him, pressed a bandage down, and hissed for him to stay quiet. The wounded man bit down on his own hand to keep from screaming. Harris looked at Joe. Not at the radio. At Joe. "If they take you," he said quietly, "they do not just get one man. They get everything you know, every pattern, every trick. They may not break you, but they might break enough." Joe's mind flashed through memories he had never asked for. Briefings about what would happen if a code talker was captured. Warnings delivered in low voices after lights out. Stories circulating about men given sidearms and told, bluntly, what those last bullets were for. He had never asked if the cyanide story was true. He had never wanted the answer. The artillery officer's voice cut back in, a thin lifeline tied to something brutal. "We are ready to fire on your mark. We need your coordinates. Danger close is authorized." Danger close. Shells so near that being alive when they hit was mostly a matter of luck and bad geometry. Harris's next words came harder, like he was forcing each one out. "You know what happens if they drag you off this hill," he said. "You know what you are carrying that none of us are." Joe did not say yes. He did not nod. He just looked at the faces around him. Flynn, jaw clenched, still firing short bursts uphill, even as splinters rained down around him. The medic, hands red, trying to keep pressure on a wound he knew was a temporary problem in a place like this. The wounded man, pale, sweating, staring at the canopy as if trying to see through it to somewhere that was not here. He thought of the other Marines who moved on other islands, trusting that when they spoke into a handset and heard Navajo on the other end, their words were safe. He thought of operations already planned based on the assumption that the code was unbroken. He thought of his grandmother telling him the language carried the soul of their people. The Japanese fire slowed for a moment, then shifted. Short bursts, not at center mass, chewing the ground in front of them, above them, to the sides, pushing them, shaping their movements. They want us to run, Joe realized. They want to drive us into a pocket where they can take us alive. The artillery officer sounded almost impatient now. "We are standing by. We need your decision. Repeat. Do you request fire on your position?" Harris did not look away. He did not tell Joe what to say. He had given him the situation. The command authority existed in the chain, but the moral weight was sitting squarely in Joe's hands. "You do not have to do this," Harris said, low. "We can try to punch through. Maybe we lose the radio, maybe we scatter. But you might get clear." Might, compared to the certainty of what would happen if he did not make the call. A grenade went off somewhere on the slope, closer than the last. The concussion punched into his chest, rattled his teeth. Dirt and leaves rained down. Flynn yelled something Joe could not make out over the ringing in his ears. Joe keyed the handset. "This is Red Fox," he said, using their call sign. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too calm. Too level. "We are fixed in place. Multiple enemies close. No escape." He paused a fraction of a second. "Request fire on our coordinates." There was a brief silence on the line. When the artillery officer spoke again, The tone had changed. The professional detachment cracked just enough to let something human through. "Say again, Red Fox. Confirm you are requesting fire on your own location." Harris closed his eyes once, opened them, and nodded. Joe took a breath that tasted like smoke and damp earth. "Confirm," he said. "Fire on our position." He rattled off the grid numbers, each one a nail. He gave them twice, then once more for clarity. The officer repeated them back. Joe corrected a single digit, because even now, precision mattered. He knew what the officers back at the fire control center were doing. Checking maps, overlaying blast radii, calculating how much of this hill would remain under the hammer of their guns. There was a pause. Not the pause of confusion. The pause of men on the other end looking at one another, knowing exactly what they were about to do. "Red Fox," the voice said finally. "You understand what you are asking." Joe looked at the team again. Flynn met his eyes, breathing hard, sweat cutting tracks through the dirt on his face. "Do it," Flynn said. "We are not going to some camp, not for questioning, not for anything." The wounded Marine tried to push himself up on one elbow. His voice was weak, but the words were clear. "Better from our guns than theirs," he said. The medic tightened his grip on the bandage, then nodded. "You start this," he said to Joe. "You finish it. Do not let them take the code." The Japanese fire picked up again, as if they sensed something shifting. Voices shouted closer now. Footsteps pounded on the slope above. Joe keyed the handset one last time. "We understand," he said quietly. "Send it." He could not say what he wanted to say in English. The words would not form. So he slipped into Navajo, the sounds grounding him, connecting him back to a place that was not this hill. "Send everything," he said in his own language. "Right here, right now." The artillery officer did not understand the words. He did not have to. "Shot out," came the response. "Rounds inbound. Time on target, 1 minute, 1 minute. 60 seconds in which every breath, every heartbeat was now measured against steel falling from the sky. Harris moved without needing to be told. "Spread out as much as you can. Use whatever cover you can find. If you are lying on top of someone when this hits, you both die." They shifted in the shallow depression, not to escape, but to avoid making it easy for the blast to take them all in a single, clean sweep. Joe dragged the radio close to his chest like a shield, even though he knew it would do nothing. The Japanese did not know what was coming. They heard their own gunfire. They heard their own shouts. They did not hear the distant thunder building over the horizon. Joe counted in his head without meaning to. 40 seconds. 30. A bullet slammed into the ground inches from his hand, sending a spray of dirt across his face. Another stitched the log where Flynn had been a moment before. Shouts in Japanese came closer, more excited now. The net was tightening to the last loop. 20 seconds. He thought of home, not in the soft, slow way stories usually told it. In flashes. His grandmother's hands weaving, the way the light hit the red rock at sunset, the taste of fry bread, the sound of his father's voice, low and steady, telling him to listen more than he spoke. 10 seconds. He thought of other radios on other islands, other code talkers' voices carrying across distances he could not imagine, all of them trusting that their words would never be turned against them. 5. He thought of the enemy code breakers, faceless men hunched over intercepted transmissions, desperate to find a pattern that was about to be buried under the bodies on this hill. Somewhere offshore, guns roared. The first shell hit low on the slope. The explosion did not sound like the grenades or mortars they were used to. It was deeper, heavier, a full body impact that punched the air out of Joe's lungs even at this distance. Trees shattered. A chunk of earth bigger than a truck lifted and fell. The second struck higher. The world turned white and brown and red all at once. Sound vanished, replaced by a pressure that felt like it was going to squeeze his skull into powder. Something hit him across the back, driving him flat. For a moment, he did not know if it was a branch, a rock, or part of someone else. He tried to breathe, coughed mud, could not hear his own voice over the ringing. More impacts, each one closer, each one ripping another piece out of the hill. Through the chaos, a single detached part of his mind noted one thing with grim satisfaction. The grid had been right. The shells were landing exactly where he had told them to. He did not know how long the barrage lasted. 10 seconds. 20. An eternity. When it finally eased, the hill was no longer a hill. It was a torn, smoking wound in the jungle. Trees snapped like matchsticks, the ground broken and cratered. Joe tried to move. Pain lit up along his side, sharp and electric. He tasted blood. The radio was still pressed against him, or what was left of it. The casing was cracked open, wires hanging, the handset crushed under something heavy. He blinked dirt and blood out of his eyes, and rolled just enough to see a few feet to his right. Flynn was there, or what was left of him. Joe forced his gaze away. There were no Japanese shouts, no gunfire, just the distant echo of the last shells and the crackle of small fires starting to take hold in the dry underbrush. He tried to push himself up, but his left arm refused to cooperate. Something was wrong with his shoulder. Something was wrong with his ribs. Breathing felt like dragging barbed wire into his chest. He did not know if anyone else from the team was still alive. He did not call out. Noise was still the enemy, even now. The radio sputtered once, a small spark arcing from a blown component. Then it went dead for good. Good, Joe thought dimly. Nothing left here for anyone to use. He lay there, the world narrowing to the patch of sky above him, smoky and broken by leaning, half-destroyed trees. If any Japanese soldiers were still alive out there, they would find only bodies and craters and a shattered radio that told them nothing. No language to dissect, no voice to torture, no key to take. He had done the one thing the training had never written down in clear ink. He had used the code as a weapon, and then, in the same breath, denied it to the enemy at the ultimate cost. The jungle that had been a trap was now a grave. His, the team's, and somewhere under the same torn earth, the last chance the Japanese had to ever pry the Navajo Code open. As his vision blurred at the edges and the sounds around him faded into something distant and far away, a thought surfaced, simple and stark. The language lives, even if he did not. Months later, on a different island under a different sky, another Navajo voice spoke into another radio, turning the chaos of battle into a clean stream of information no Japanese ear could decode. The war had moved on. The maps on briefing room walls had new circles, new arrows, new names, but the sound in the headsets was the same. At Iwo Jima, 6 Navajo radio operators worked without rest during the first 48 hours of the invasion, sending hundreds of messages that all arrived exactly as intended. Officers later said that without them, units would have been cut off, fire support would have missed, and whole lines might have buckled under Japanese counterattacks. The Japanese still listened, they still recorded. They still tried to break the strange language that floated across the airwaves at the worst moments for their forces. Intelligence officers traced the signals, mapped them, gathered stacks of intercepted traffic, and fed them to cryptographers who had cracked other American codes before. But nothing worked. The Navajo Code did not collapse into patterns or reveal hidden mathematics. There were no code books to capture, no cipher wheels to steal, no machines to copy. Just human voices and a structure built on a language that did not fit into any of their reference systems. Somewhere in that war of charts and headphones and marked-up transcripts, someone realized a brutal truth. The chance they had once had to capture a live Navajo operator in the field and squeeze the secrets from him had vanished in craters and splintered trees. Whatever opportunity had existed died on a nameless patch of jungle where an artillery barrage erased men, radios, and questions in the same blast. The war in the Pacific ground forward, island by island, beach by beach. Every major Marine operation used Navajo Code Talkers to carry orders, corrections, and last-minute changes that had to be fast and had to be secure. They called in naval gunfire, redirected aircraft, coordinated separate units in the middle of chaos. The men who heard their voices on the line did not always know who they were. They just knew that when that unfamiliar language came through the headset, things started to happen where and when they were supposed to. Targets vanished. Reinforcements arrived in the right place. Artillery landed on the enemy, not on friendly positions. By the time Japan finally surrendered in 1945, the Navajo Code had been used in thousands of transmissions without being broken once. Not compromised, not decrypted, not even partially understood by the enemy. It went into the war as an experiment and came out as one of the few systems that never failed in the way other codes eventually did. Then, just as quickly as it had come into the light of battle, it disappeared again. The program was classified. Reports were sealed. The Code Talkers went home under orders not to speak about what they had done. On paper, they were just another wave of returning veterans, men with campaign medals and scars who slid back into a country that did not know what they had carried on their backs and in their heads. Some found work, some struggled. Some carried their memories like a quiet weight that never quite went away. They had been at the center of operations that reshaped the world, but they did not have stories they could share at kitchen tables beyond vague phrases and edited fragments. On reservations in the Southwest, life went on. Dusty roads, crowded houses, schools where the rules had not changed as much as outsiders liked to pretend. Children were still told to use English. Teachers still acted as if Navajo belonged in the past. But the men who had worn uniforms and helmets and walked through jungle and ash knew something those teachers did not. They knew their language had saved lives on islands most Americans would never be able to find on a map. They had watched officers and senior commanders lean in closer when they spoke into radios, had seen strategic decisions fall into place because a message in Navajo traveled faster than any code machine. For decades, the full story stayed buried. The official record simply did not mention how critical the code had been. Historians wrote about generals and admirals, about aircraft carriers and bombing campaigns, about island-hopping strategies and casualty counts. In 1968, the classification finally lifted. Documents were declassified. reports surfaced. The phrase Navajo Code Talker began to appear in print, where it had never been allowed before. Slowly, the outline of what they had done became visible to the public. Interviews followed. Old men in plain shirts and worn boots sat under bright lights and tried, in a language more familiar to America, to explain how another language had turned radio waves into a weapon. They talked about training, about the vocabulary they had built, about the pressure of knowing that a single mistake in a string of words could send shells into the wrong valley. Some remembered nights when they had heard their own coordinates asked for, felt the edge of decisions that could erase them along with the enemy. Some talked quietly, almost offhand, about what they had been told to do if capture ever became a real possibility. They did not always give names when they talked about men who had not come back. Sometimes they just said one of ours. Sometimes they just looked down for a long moment, as if seeing a hill or a beach that no longer existed the way it had when they were there. Recognition came slowly, then all at once. Medals, unit citations, invitations to speak at schools and military ceremonies. Monuments were built, some on reservation land, some in places far from the mesas and canyons where those voices had first learned their words. In 2001, the United States finally awarded congressional gold medals to the original 29 Navajo Code Talkers, and silver medals to the later group who joined them. The country that had once tried to stamp out their language now lined halls with people clapping for the men who had used that same language to help win a war. Not all of them were there to see it. Some had already died. Some had gone quietly, their stories half told or not told at all. But the code itself, the idea that a language born in one small part of the world could hold against the full weight of an enemy intelligence apparatus, had taken its place in history. What did not make it into the speeches and plaques were the specific hills, the specific jungles, the specific moments when survival and compromise stood on opposite sides of a single choice. Those moments lived in fragments, in a line here, a hint there, a memory of a transmission cut short. Somewhere in that web of half-told stories is a hill that never got a name on a map, a hill where a small team called in reports until the enemy closed the distance too far, a hill where a code talker made the kind of decision that never fits neatly into official language. No photograph exists of the instant he pressed the handset to his lips and gave the coordinates that would erase his own position. No recording captured the strain in his voice as he switched from English to Navajo for the last sentence. No enemy analyst ever got to replay that transmission and circle it in red pencil as the one that got away. What does remain is the result. The Japanese never broke the Navajo Code, not by capturing an operator, not by decoding intercepted messages, not by forcing the language open under torture or interrogation. The code survived the war intact and untouched. The language went home with the men who had carried it, scarred by what they had seen, but unbroken by the enemy they had fought. It moved back into houses and hogans and family gatherings, where it was used to tell jokes and scold children and pass on stories that had nothing to do with artillery and invasion beaches. In those stories, sometimes, a different kind of detail slipped through. A mention of a man who did not come back from a mission no one could talk about. A radio that never returned. A hill where nothing grew right for a long time because something had burned it too hard. For most people, the Navajo Code Talkers' legacy is a clean line. They helped win the war. Their code was never broken. They were finally honored. But under that clean line, there are choices that do not fit on medals. Like the choice to keep speaking when the enemy is close enough to shout. Like the choice to trade one small position, one small team, for the safety of thousands who will never know your name. In the end, the story of the Navajo Code is not just about clever linguistics or military innovation. It is about men who carried an entire language into battle, knowing that the worst thing that could happen was not dying with it, but living long enough for it to be taken apart in front of them. It is about the quiet, terrible power of a decision made on a hill with a radio under fire. Somewhere between the classified reports and the unmarked graves, one fact holds. The code never broke. Not in enemy labs, not in interrogation rooms, not under torture, and not in the hands of a man who, when the circle closed and the wind carried the sound of boots and shouted orders, chose coordinates over capture.